The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible, authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and Flight Bridge Ed in their entirety.
We've been diving into the FAST archives, and today I've got another talk for you from a previous FAST event. This time we'll be hearing from Ginger Locke of Medic Mindset. Ginger gave a talk a couple years back called Finding Feedback, and it's all about feedback in the crazy world of EMS and critical care transport. We tend to only hear about the wild headline-making calls, whether something went really, really good or really, really bad, but Ginger wants us to focus on those everyday moments, the ones where nobody put on a cape, nobody made front page news. So whether you're a trauma magnet or you grind out the mundane calls, Ginger's got some seriously insightful stuff here to share. And hey, don't forget about Fast 24. There's tons of talks and workshops with lots of great learning opportunities just like this talk. We'll see you there. Enjoy the podcast.
Anyone else struggle with this type of shower control? It's an older kind, and no matter which way you turn it, it seems like cold water comes out at first. You can turn it left or right. I turn it all the way to the left, cold water comes out. I turn it back the other way, like a maniac, the other way. Still cold water coming out. Turn it back the other way, cold water coming out, and then I put my hand under and I think, is this a little warmer than it was, or is my hand now just getting used to the cold water? I'm an overthinking maniac with this. The missing piece in this story of overthinking is feedback. Because what do I do as the water's traveling through the pipes? It takes time, right? 5 to 10 seconds for that hot water to come. I don't get any feedback from the system. And what do I do during that time? I question my ability to operate one simple knob. Don Norman is an engineer who evaluates the design of everyday objects. He wrote this book. He's worked for Apple, things like shower controls. And he says that when using a device, the user craves feedback within 1/10 of a second after performing an action. They want to know that the device understood their action. Any longer, the user now gets disoriented about where am I in the system, at best. At worst, they get frustrated and put the device away forever. Feedback is critical to the development of skilled behavior. He says that lack of feedback creates a feeling of lack of control, which can be unsettling. And right now, there's a tremendous scarcity of feedback in EMS. Anecdotally, I know this from talking to paramedics for the last 6 years, recording the podcast, and there's also evidence for this. In this study from 2017, Drs. Rebecca Cash, Dr. Rimley Crow, they looked at 15,000 respondents. These are all emergency care providers. And they found that nearly half, so every other one of you, half received zero feedback about their medical care in the 30 days prior. This is my schematic for performance, kind of how we run calls. On the side with the red, I think these are our, if you look at performance at the bottom, this is where we struggle. Performance suffers, we make a med error. On the other side, the green zone, this is where something unusually amazing happens. I think we get feedback on the polarized ends, but the middle, the bread and butter of our day-to-day care, I think it's largely unknown how we're doing. Why is this bad? The obvious reason is that we know the thing that links deliberate practice to expertise, what's in between those two things, is feedback. But even more important than this, in this paper in JSEPT of 2019, again, Dr. Crow found a link between feedback and burnout. They found that for providers who received performance feedback from a supervisor, there was a 64% reduction in odds of experiencing burnout. So where do we find this feedback? Where is it? Where is it hiding? This paper just came out March of 22. Caitlin Wilson in the UK, she's a PhD candidate, and she did a qualitative survey. She talked to 24 emergency medical providers about their experience of where do you go look for feedback within your system right now. How do you know how you're doing? And they came up with these 4 places. They look at their patient outcomes. They get formal evaluations from bosses. Their debriefings after these red zone calls. And then some peer-to-peer feedback. And the paper really emphasized this patient outcomes. And I think this is correct. We've made tremendous strides in the last decade. We can now, because of electronic medical records, we can now hook in and see how did our patients turn out. But I think patient outcomes is an interesting metric. Because as you know, I certainly know, I can totally suck up a call and my patient does okay despite me. Or I can perform really well and they deteriorate. I'm more interested in feedback about our process on calls. And I want to tell you a story about a paramedic who's also interested in her process. She's been a paramedic for 10 years in one system, her whole 10 years, in a really large system. Plenty of educators, lots of peers. And it all started with a text. She said, I know it's Christmas. You're probably busy, but I was wondering if we could meet up soon. She said, I'm struggling a little bit at work. So we quickly got together. I'm assuming something really bad has happened, a bad call, some burnout, conflict with a peer. We met face to face. We sat down and she said, this is really embarrassing, but for the last 2 years, I haven't been able to get an IV. And when I heard this, I actually kind of relaxed in my chair because I thought, okay, IVs, this isn't a bad call. IVs, this is an easy fix, right? Easy feedback's easy fix. So we landed in the lab. We worked with a mannequin arm. We took some video of her doing it correctly so she could take that home with her. I even sent the arm home with her. Lots of repetition. Easy feedback, easy fix. She came back a week later. We did some live sticks. We sorted out that the problem was a new catheter that had been introduced into the system 2 years prior. But I left this interaction. I thought, why was she coming to me? I had been her initial educator, but 10 years ago. We had stayed friends, but why was she coming to me? She's embedded in this large agency with a whole team of educators. And I think the answer is she currently doesn't exist in a feedback culture. It should have been normalized for her to just phone up an educator or a supervisor or a peer. This was just IVs. So what is a culture of feedback? I think culture is a hard word to pin down. I think it's just a mashup of tens of thousands of micro interactions. And I want to take you through the next slide, and I want you to think about where you work. Think about your shop. And as I go through, ask yourself, is this the culture I'm currently working in? And if it's not, can we inject some things into it to encourage this culture? I think there are 3 key indicators. The positive feedback that you get right now heavily outweighs the negative feedback. Experts in feedback emphasize that over the course of a relationship, and that's important, okay? So it has to be over time, not just in one single interaction. Over the course of a relationship, the positive feedback that you receive greatly outweighs the negative, to the tune of 3 to 1. Some experts say 10 to 1. You should be getting feedback every shift. If you're mostly getting radio silence unless something goes wrong, that's not feedback, right? Silence is not feedback. The feedback that you're getting should be face to face. If you're getting an email from somebody in another office after a chart review and that's the end of the feedback, that is an okay place to start, but feedback is a conversation between 2 people. So this is what it should look like. What is blocking this up? Why do we not have this? Feedback blocker number 1. It can be uncomfortable to give and receive feedback. We shy away from these difficult conversations. And in this talk, I want to tell you about what I've learned from people like Ashley Liebig, Morton's here. I want to tell you what I've learned so we can all begin learning en masse, all of us, how to do this, how to do these conversations. Feedback blocker number 2, our supervisors are busy. If we're counting on them to bring the feedback, we may be looking in the wrong spot. They're not on calls with us. They're definitely not in that yellow zone, the bread and butter zone. And they really only get alerted when something goes south. So instead of blaming the supervisors for not giving us more feedback, what if we accept the system exactly as it is and figure out where we can find feedback within that system? Because the calls in the yellow zone, they are never making it across the desk of a QA manager or a supervisor. How do we find feedback for those? Going back to this paper from Dr. Crow, remember there were 15,000 respondents to this survey? So she was able to cohort and look at HEMS medics versus ground medics. Who was getting feedback? The title is disparities. So who's getting it, who's not? And she found that HEMS medics, aeromedical medics, get a lot more than ground 911 medics. A lot more feedback. To the tune of 2.9, almost 3 times more likely than ground medics to receive feedback. I think the answer to our question about where to find feedback is in this piece of data right here. So I got to thinking about HEMS culture, aeromedical. What are y'all doing differently than the ground folks? And what I know is there are required safety debriefings. There's certain conversations that are required as part of your culture. And I think that starts a dialogue and you start to learn those skills, and that creeps into the clinical side. It's normalized. It's baked into the culture. So how do we build on this? I think the answer is learning how to give peer-to-peer feedback. No one's coming. It's up to us. And requiring this. And beginning to learn the tools for how to implement this. Because our peers, they're primed to do this. They meet all of these check boxes. They can give us more positive than negative feedback. If they're on a call with you, they see you do 100 things correctly. Because most calls kind of go like that. Most things go right, and we can talk about the things that went well and we want to keep doing. They're there every shift. They're there face to face. If we're going to work toward peer-to-peer feedback, we need to talk about some fundamentals. You can think about feedback as a procedure. It has risks and benefits. Done poorly, relationships can suffer, performance kind of stagnates. Done well, relationships can deepen and performance soars. Feedback is a procedure, but it can be a tricky procedure. And that's because identity is at the heart of feedback. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we want for the future. And feedback directly attacks that, particularly negative feedback. Here's a beautiful story written by a well-known surgeon and author, Atul Gawande. It was in the New Yorker. He brought in a peer to his surgeries. Their sole purpose of this peer was to just observe and provide feedback at the end, prompt feedback at the end. And apparently it took Dr. Gawande on a journey, because here are some of his reflections. He said, Osteen was the peer coach. Osteen watched, silent and taking notes. My cheeks burned. I was mortified. I had let Osteen see my judgment fail. I had let him see that I may not be who I want to be. This is identity. One of the most influential, accomplished surgeons of our time, feeling this strain on identity. But he also says this about his peer-to-peer reflection or feedback. He said, that one 20-minute discussion gave me more to consider and work on than I'd had in the past 5 years when he had just been working alone in his surgeries. These are the benefits of peer-to-peer feedback. Feedback happens at the intersection of the learner's desire to improve and their desire to preserve their identity. And both of these desires run deep. So how do we take care of and balance both of these desires? The authors in this book say, stay alert for when a seemingly benign conversation has turned into a crucial conversation. Thinking back to the paramedic that we worked on IVs, I thought we were just talking about IVs, very straightforward, very benign. As she started talking about, I'm effectively not a paramedic, I can't get down my ALS care plans, I can't start an IV, so I'm basically not a paramedic. That's when I knew we were in a crucial conversation. The person on the receiving end of feedback begins dual processing during these conversations. They're not just hearing your feedback, they're also juggling all of this emotional response to your feedback. The question in their head goes from, do you approve of my decision on this call, to do you approve of me? One of the key things you can do in advance of these conversations is preload the relationship with lots of positive feedback. And that takes effort because we're often just responding to kind of negative things. We have to deliberately provide positive feedback to our peers, because this idea of a critique sandwich, you've definitely been on the receiving end of this. If you've gone through any medical training, this is where educators try to give a little positive feedback at the beginning, negative feedback in the middle. The negative feedback, by the way, is the actual feedback, the thing you need to hear, and then they tack on a little positive at the end. Adult learners see right through this. It's disingenuous, right? You have to preload the relationship prior to giving the feedback that needs to be given. It is perfectly okay to give the feedback that needs to be given, even when it's critical, so long as we've preloaded the relationship with positivity. Dr. Natalie May, an EM physician, she says before entering a feedback conversation, so before you ever give feedback to anyone, ask yourself these questions. If any of them are no, she says don't do it. Slow down. Let someone else do it. Come back and do it later. Is the feedback desired? So if this is peer-to-peer and they ask for feedback, so after this talk, if I were to go up to a peer speaker and say, how did I do? The next question for them needs to be, what type of feedback do you want? Because if they start talking about, you really jacked up your slides at the beginning, Ginger, and I want feedback on content, right? We may get alienated from one another. So if someone asks you for feedback, ask for what type, or what is it that they're wanting feedback on? Is the feedback necessary? This comes up after simulations. If you're an educator doing simulation, you've watched 20, 30 minutes of performance. You want to give them feedback on everything you saw. You want to cram in this. This is an opportunity to give them all this educational content. Resist that temptation and restrict it to 2 or 3 things tops. 2 or 3 takeaway points that you really want them to remember, because the human brain can only absorb so much. Is this the right time and place? Our world is fast and busy and loud. Right? The right time and place for feedback is usually quiet and slow, right? So reserve it for when you have the time and bandwidth for that. Right after a bad call, I think we all know this, right after a really bad call, not the time for any feedback. This is the time when we ask each other, are you okay? Am I the right person to give the feedback? If you find yourself emotionally charged when it's time to give the feedback, you're not the right person. Right? You need to be pretty neutral. So what you can do is step back, let someone else do it, or do it later. Okay, this can always happen later. Feedback is a learning conversation that starts with observed data. That data might originate from a chart review. It might originate from watching a sim. It might originate from being on an actual call with your partner. Right? You might be there and see it with your own eyes. No matter what data you think you have, remember this. There is an unconscious translation that happens after collecting data, and during which time we interpret it. And that interpretation, this down yellow arrow, that's our frame. A frame that could be flawed or incomplete. So remember that between observing something and interpreting what we saw, this is unconscious translation. All right, but we don't need to pretend we're without a frame. In fact, you can start the conversation there. Start it with your frame. Start it with your hypothesis. From my perspective, during this point in the call, it looked like this was going on. Then learn their frame. What was going on to you? What thoughts were you having? What were you noticing on the call during that time? You start layering these two frames, both of which have content that needs to be illuminated. As you do that, as you start laying out these schematics, now we can agree on an accepted frame. Not who is right, but what is right. After this conversation that can be kind of lengthy, make a plan, right? You just did all of this dialogue, all of this cognitive autopsy. Make a plan of how will we move forward. Tomorrow morning, Ashley Liebig's going to be talking about debriefing. Probably dig into this a lot more. So don't stay up too late. Be there for that. First thing in the morning. This is not always a super smooth procedure. We will encounter defensive receivers of feedback. Heck, I've been a defensive receiver of feedback just this semester. It's because we all have baggage. We've all been on the receiving end of feedback poorly delivered. The best tool to mitigate this defensiveness is to build the relationship in advance of the feedback. And someday, if you're in one of these conversations and you feel like it's going a little sideways, or maybe they're having trouble making eye contact with you, it feels like there's a disconnect between the two of you, remember this slide. Identity is at the heart of all of this. And remember Atul Gawande's story. Preservation of identity is at the heart of all of this, and the need to preserve identity runs deep. Take good care with them. We need more feedback in EMS. I think our peers are the ones who are going to bring it to us. It's how we get better. And there looks to be a link in decreasing burnout with more feedback. Our first step is to arm ourselves and our peers with the tools to have these feedback conversations, perhaps require it. And this will normalize an environment where coaching is constant between all of us. There's a longer version of this talk at Medic Mindset. It's got all the books that I've referenced and all the papers. It has been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. All right. Do we have any questions?
Hi, Ginger.
Hey, Jeff.
So I guess my question is around when you're providing feedback to someone and maybe they're not ready to receive it. Maybe it's after a bad call. Maybe you're choosing the wrong time and they respond, I guess, negatively or even aggressively and pushing back. Is that the right time to disengage and choose a better time, or how would you approach that situation?
This was one I've experienced, right? Because I'm with learners all day and they're under high pressure, they're under a pressure cooker. So I get this. They have days like that where they're just not in the place, or it's the wrong time for them to get that. And I bring them a little closer emotionally and just start connecting human to human and stop the feedback. And I realize when that happens, I'm like, okay, we need to build up the bank more. You need to trust me more before we can get there.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you, Ginger.
Yeah, thank you guys very much.
Wonderful as always.
This has been a production of the Flight Bridge Ed Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.